A white cop pulled a gun on a black woman for driving a nice car. He thought she was powerless, but what he didn't know, she was the Deputy Director of Homeland Security. And when her federal backup arrived, the whole world watched him fall. Before we dive into this shocking story, let us know where you're at in the comments. And if you like thrilling, gripping stories, don't forget to subscribe. The Virginia night stretched wide and peaceful, the horizon painted with the soft glow of a setting sun bleeding into deep twilight. The sky wore a shawl of burnt orange and violet, the last light of day casting long shadows over the manicured lawns and quiet cul-de-sacs of Fairfax County. Streetlights flickered to life one by one, their hum low beneath the gentle chirp of crickets, as Danielle Vaughn guided her midnight blue SUV down the familiar suburban road. She eased into a rhythm, her hands steady on the wheel, the soft notes of John Coltrane weaving through the speakers. A small ritual, her way of closing out long days filled with high-stakes decisions and national security briefings. Deputy Director of the Department of Homeland Security's Cybercrime Division, that title weighed heavy some days. But tonight she felt lighter. No classified documents, no crisis calls, just the promise of her modest home waiting in Arlington, where she'd kick off her heels and lose herself in leftovers in a true crime podcast. The dashboard clock blinked 8:47 p.m. 10 miles to go. Danielle allowed herself to settle deeper into her seat, her mind slowly unwinding from the relentless pace of her day. But even as the jazz soothed her, her posture stayed upright, her gaze sharp. After 44 years navigating the world as a black woman in America, some instincts never dulled. She drove the speed limit, signaled every turn, double-checked every mirror, not because she feared making a mistake, but because she knew that even perfection could be twisted against her. And still, the lights came. Red and blue flashes pierced the rearview mirror, their strobe burning through the cocoon of calm she'd carefully wrapped around herself. Her heart gave a jolt, the adrenaline rushing so quickly it felt like she'd hit a bump in the road. Her jaw clenched, not out of fear. She'd seen too much to fear easily, but from the dull, suffocating weight of familiar frustration. "Here we go," she muttered under her breath. Danielle steered her SUV gently onto the gravel shoulder, the crunch beneath her tires the only sound as she powered down the music. She clicked on the interior light, always let them see your hands, and placed both palms square on the steering wheel. Her mind ran through the checklist, calm, visible, no sudden moves. These weren't the habits of a reckless driver. These were the survival instincts passed down like heirlooms through generations of black Americans who knew that traffic stops weren't just inconveniences. They were battlegrounds. The siren gave a short whoop and then silence. Danielle's gaze flicked up to her mirror, catching sight of the figure approaching. White male, late 20s, swagger in his step. His flashlight snapped on before he even reached her window, the beam slicing across her face like a searchlight. She could see the nameplate gleaming on his uniform. Officer Kyle Mercer. Tap, tap, tap. His knuckles rapped sharply against the glass, the sound hollow and commanding. Danielle pressed the button to lower her window halfway, keeping her body still, her face neutral but composed. "Good evening, officer," she began, her voice calm but firm, edged with polite authority. "Is there a problem?" Mercer's gaze lingered too long, the flashlight fixed on her face, his eyes narrowing as if trying to read something beneath her skin. His jaw tightened. No greeting, no explanation. "License and registration," he barked flatly, the flashlight beam unwavering. Danielle kept her hands on the wheel. "I'll be happy to provide that," she said smoothly. "But could you tell me why you've pulled me over?" The pause stretched thin, like the string of a violin before it snapped. Mercer shrugged, flashlight still aimed at her eyes. "Your car caught my eye," he said, his voice slick with the kind of casual arrogance that made Danielle's stomach churn. "Just need to check things out." Caught his eye. Her brow furrowed, but she didn't let the irritation crack through her voice. "Officer, I was driving 35 miles per hour, used my signal at every turn, and followed all traffic laws. I'd like to know exactly what I did wrong." Mercer's posture stiffened, and his jaw ticked. The flashlight drifted down, but the edge in his voice sharpened like a blade. "Look, I don't need a reason to check your papers," he snapped. "Hand them over and let's make this quick." Danielle inhaled slowly, her fingers tightening against the leather steering wheel. She knew her rights, knew the law better than Mercer ever would. But that knowledge tasted bitter when served in moments like this. This wasn't about law. This was about power. The kind that wore a badge and thought it gave him the right to make her small. But she wasn't about to shrink. Officer Mercer, she repeated his name deliberately, locking her gaze with his. I'm requesting that you provide a valid reason for this stop, as required by law. The gravel under Mercer's boots crunched louder as he stepped closer, leaning down so that his face hovered just outside the window. The flashlight flicked back up to her face, harsh and unrelenting. You don't get to tell me how to do my job, he sneered. Your car looks out of place. That's enough for me. Danielle felt it then, the sting beneath the words. Out of place. A black woman in a luxury SUV in a suburban neighborhood. She'd lived this before. Heard the coded language that shielded prejudice behind procedure. Her pulse quickened, not from fear, but from the familiar ache of knowing her existence was always being questioned. She moved slowly, deliberately, reaching for her purse on the passenger seat, pulling out her license and registration. She held them out, but didn't hand them over just yet. Out of place, she repeated softly, the words tasting like ash. I live 10 miles from here. I drive this road every day. Mercer's lips curled into a smirk. Well, you're not home yet. Danielle's breath caught in her chest, the air turning thick, weighted with the knowledge of what could come next. She'd trained agents on de-escalation tactics, briefed Congress on cyber threats, and stood in war rooms monitoring global crises. But here, on this darkened shoulder, she was just another black body stopped by white authority. She could comply. She could make this easy. But something inside her tightened, hardened. This wasn't just about her. This was about every black person who'd been forced to lower their eyes, to make themselves small, to survive. Danielle kept her voice steady, even as her heart pounded louder than the crickets outside. I'll cooperate fully, she said, but I'm requesting that you follow protocol. Provide a valid reason for this stop. Mercer's face darkened and his hand twitched near his belt. That familiar motion, the one that sent a chill down her spine. The one she'd read about in reports too many times. His next words slashed through the air. Get out of the car. The gravel pressed beneath her tires. The sun had set. The shadows had deepened, and the storm was coming. The gravel beneath the SUV whispered as Danielle Vaughn shifted slightly in her seat, her body still framed by the soft glow of the dashboard lights. Outside her window, Officer Kyle Mercer loomed closer, the tension radiating off him like static in the night air. His flashlight's harsh beam cut across her face again, painting sharp lines of shadow across her features. But Danielle didn't flinch. Her hands remained steady on the wheel, palms open, visible. A posture not of submission, but of survival. For a moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them, locked in this quiet standoff. Mercer's voice had changed, shedding any pretense of civility. His last words, "Get out of the car," hung heavy in the night air, coated with threat, daring her to push back. Danielle's pulse quickened beneath her calm surface, her body thrumming with the familiar clash of fear and fury. She had spent years in war rooms, had stared down cybercriminals and terrorists, yet nothing ever felt quite as volatile as this. A single traffic stop where the wrong word, the wrong move, could ignite everything. Here, her badge meant nothing. Her authority vanished beneath the shadow of a white man with a gun and unchecked power. Danielle took a slow breath, filling her lungs with the humid Virginia night, steadying her voice. Officer Mercer, I've asked repeatedly for the legal basis of this stop. I've complied with your requests. There's no lawful reason for me to step out of my vehicle. Her words were measured, precise, the kind you learn to wield like armor. But Mercer's smirk only deepened, his jaw flexing under the brim of his hat. His hand hovered near his belt, fingers dancing dangerously close to his holster. The power dynamic shifted in the beam of his flashlight, and Danielle could feel the weight of every black woman who had ever stood in this place, knowing the rules, playing by them, and still being criminalized. I told you already, Mercer snapped, leaning closer so that his face filled the window frame. Your car's out of place. You're out of place. I don't owe you any more than that. His voice dripped with condescension, but beneath it, the undercurrent of aggression sharpened. Danielle could feel her blood heat beneath her skin, the familiar flush of anger wrapped in helplessness. She wasn't out of place. She belonged here. But belonging doesn't shield you when someone decides you don't fit the picture they've painted in their head. The air between them thickened as Mercer pressed on, his tone turning from professional to personal. See, people like you always got something to say. Always think you're smarter than the badge. His lips curled, his eyes gleaming with something darker. But out here, I'm the law. Danielle felt her grip tighten on the steering wheel, the leather pressing into her palms, grounding her. She had trained federal agents on de-escalation, had drilled teams on handling high-pressure negotiations, but this wasn't a tactical operation. This was racism raw and unfiltered, dressed in a uniform. Her mind raced, weighing the options, comply or resist. She could step out, give him the satisfaction of her submission, but what then? What precedent would that set? If she, a deputy director, folded here, what did that say to the black teenager in the next town who wouldn't have her resources or her rank? I've done nothing wrong, Danielle said again, her voice edged with steel. If you have no probable cause, I am not stepping out of this vehicle. That's my right, officer. The smirk cracked. Mercer's face hardened, and for the first time his posture shifted from smug to dangerous. His hand moved, just a flicker. But the motion made Danielle's stomach flip. She'd seen that twitch in 1,000 training videos, read it in countless reports that ended in blood and funerals. You don't get to decide what your rights are out here, Mercer growled, his voice dropping low, predatory. I'm giving you a lawful order. Step out, or I'll make you. Danielle's heart pounded so loudly she could hear it echoing inside her skull, but her hand stayed steady, planted firmly on the wheel. Her mouth was dry, but her mind was clear. This wasn't about the law anymore. This was about a man who thought his badge gave him the right to break it. I'm not resisting, she said slowly, deliberately. I'm asking for fairness. You've given me no cause for this stop. None. That's not just my opinion. That's the law. Mercer took a step back, his silhouette sharp against the halo of his cruiser's headlights. For a second, Danielle thought he might back down. But then his fingers twitched again, drifting once more toward his holster, and the dread settled cold in her chest. You're going to regret this, he muttered. Danielle's breath hitched, but her expression didn't waver. This was the breaking point, the moment the line would either hold or shatter. She could feel the weight of the system behind Mercer, the unchecked power, the racism dressed in procedure. And in that moment, the years of fighting from inside the machine, of believing in justice, all crashed against the reality of this man with a gun and a grudge. She moved carefully, her every motion deliberate, reaching with excruciating slowness toward the dashboard-mounted phone. Her thumb flicked the recording app, the red light blinking to life, casting a soft glow into the cabin. Mercer saw it. His lips curled back in disgust. You think a damn camera's gonna save you? He spat. But Danielle caught the hesitation in his eyes, that flicker of doubt. It's not about saving me, she said, her voice soft but cutting. It's about the truth. The air crackled as they stared each other down, but Mercer wasn't finished. His face twisted in rage, and he slammed his palm against her door so hard it rattled. Get out of the car, now, he bellowed, the sound reverberating through the empty road. Danielle's body jolted, the instinctual flinch betraying her calm for just a second. But she caught herself, forcing her shoulders back, her chin high. She was not backing down. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of her fear. I don't feel safe, she said, her tone unwavering. I'm not stepping out without cause. You have no cause. Mercer's hand hovered, fingers grazing the grip of his pistol, and Danielle's heart thundered. She was one heartbeat away from this turning deadly, from being another name scrawled on a protest sign. Another headline in a cycle that never ended. She held her ground, her body still, her voice steady, but inside the battle raged, her helplessness and fury warring as the thin line between control and catastrophe stretched thinner. This wasn't just a stop. This was a fight for dignity, for survival, for every black person who'd ever been told they didn't belong. The night stayed silent except for the sound of Mercer's hand tapping against the holster, a silent threat hanging between them. Danielle's breath slowed, her resolve sharpening. She would not be broken. The night had thickened, folding in on itself as the confrontation on the roadside stretched taut, every second pulling the thread tighter. Danielle Vaughn sat motionless behind the wheel of her SUV, her hands open on the steering wheel, her breath shallow but steady. The blinking red light of her dashboard camera casting a rhythmic glow across the dark interior. The suburban Virginia road, once silent and unassuming, now felt like the center of a storm about to break. Officer Kyle Mercer's silhouette stood rigid outside her window, the flashlight beam flickering as it danced across her face, but no longer steady. His hand shook now. His other hovered near his holster, fingers grazing the grip of his sidearm, tracing that fatal edge between threat and action. His breathing, once controlled, had grown jagged, like a man cornered not by danger, but by the collapse of his own authority. Danielle's heart thudded behind her ribs, each beat reverberating against her sternum like a war drum. She could feel the weight of every story she'd read, every headline she'd wept over. Black lives ended on roadsides just like this. Bodies slumped behind wheels, justified by words like non-compliance and officer safety. She had spent decades climbing the ranks of Homeland Security, crafting policies meant to protect the country. But here, none of it shielded her. Here, she was just another black woman in the wrong place, in the wrong skin. Mercer's jaw clenched, his flashlight dipping as he barked the command again, louder now, more desperate. "I said, step out of the vehicle." Danielle didn't move. Her voice, a thin veneer of calm stretched over the roaring fire inside, responded, "You have no lawful cause. I've complied. I am not stepping out without reason." The flashlight snapped off, plunging the scene into deeper darkness, leaving only the low glow of streetlights and the flashing pulse of her camera. In that moment, she saw the shift in his eyes, the moment he made the decision. His hand shot down to the holster. Metal scraped leather. The gun came free. Her breath caught, an invisible fist closing around her throat. Mercer raised the weapon, leveling it through the open window, the barrel gleaming under the streetlight, as it pointed directly at her chest. The world seemed to freeze, contracting around the glint of steel and the pounding of her pulse. She stared down the black maw of the gun, the air electric, suffocating. "Out!" Mercer's voice cracked with raw, unhinged fury. "Now, or I swear—" Danielle didn't hear the rest. She was too focused on the weight of the gun, the way Mercer's hand trembled. Whether from adrenaline or rage, she couldn't tell. She knew this was the point where so many lives slipped away, where one pull of a trigger transformed a routine stop into a funeral. Her training screamed at her to stay still, to stay calm, to survive. But her soul, the one shaped by every time she'd been followed in a store, every time a man like Mercer had looked at her with that same mixture of contempt and control, raged. Her mouth opened, her voice softer than before, but sharpened to a point. "Officer Mercer, you're pointing a loaded weapon at an unarmed citizen who has done nothing wrong. You're breaking the law. Put the gun down." His hand twitched, the gun jerking slightly as if he'd been jolted, but it didn't lower. "You think you're above the law," Mercer spat, voice shaking, "sitting there, giving me orders. That's not how this works." Danielle's fingers flexed against the steering wheel, knuckles whitening. Her body screamed at her to move, to duck, to run, but she forced herself to stay rooted, every nerve stretched to breaking. She wouldn't give him a reason to fire. "I know the law better than you do, Officer Mercer," she replied, her tone steel-wrapped velvet. "You are escalating a peaceful encounter. I am unarmed. I am no threat to you. You're the threat here." The words hung between them, vibrating like a live wire. Mercer's grip tightened. "Keep running that mouth. See what happens." Danielle's heart pounded harder, but her face remained composed, every inch of her fighting back the rising tide of fear. Helplessness clawed at her insides, but she refused to let it show. She wasn't just fighting for herself now. She was fighting for every black person who had been silenced by fear of the badge. Slowly, deliberately, she glanced at the blinking camera light. "This is all recorded," she reminded him. "Your gun, your words, your threats." Mercer's eyes darted to the phone, the flashing red dot slicing through his bravado. His chest rose and fell in uneven bursts, the gun trembling slightly as the weight of the camera pressed against him. But his finger stayed curled near the trigger, as if anger alone could justify murder. Danielle felt the storm rise inside her, the battle between terror and resolve. She would not let this man make her small, not now, not after everything. "I am Deputy Director Danielle Vaughn," she said, each word ringing clear in the humid night. "Department of Homeland Security, you have pulled a gun on a federal official without cause. You will put that weapon down or answer for it." For a second, the world seemed to stop. Mercer's eyes flickered, confusion breaking through the fury as her words sank in. His grip faltered. "You're lying," he hissed, but there was no conviction behind it, just fear. "I'm not," Danielle pressed, seizing the crack in his armor. "And you know it. You've made the worst mistake of your career, and the whole world will know." The seconds stretched like an eternity, the gun still aimed at her heart, the space between them thick with danger. Then, faint in the distance, a sound. Sirens, growing louder. Mercer's jaw tightened, sweat beading on his forehead as the reality of his situation sank in, but he didn't lower the gun. Danielle stayed still, her voice softening but losing none of its power. "It's over, Officer Mercer. You can end this now before it gets worse." The sirens wailed closer, a sound of salvation and dread. Would they come to help her or back him up? The weight of the moment pressed against Danielle's chest, the line between life and death razor thin, but she refused to blink, refused to surrender. In that final moment as the sirens neared and the gun still hovered between them, Danielle felt something shift, not in Mercer, but in herself. She wasn't just surviving this night. She was fighting for every voice that had been silenced on roads like this, for every life cut short by the power behind a badge and a gun. The battle wasn't over, but Danielle Vaughn was still here, still fighting. The wail of sirens pierced the night, slicing through the suffocating silence that had gripped the roadside like a vice. Danielle Vaughn sat frozen behind the wheel of her SUV, her hands still fixed on the steering wheel, every nerve on edge, every muscle coiled tight beneath her composed exterior. Across from her, Officer Kyle Mercer's gun remained pointed directly at her chest, the barrel gleaming beneath the flicker of the distant patrol lights. The sirens grew louder, no longer a faint echo in the distance, but a scream hurtling toward them, growing brighter, closer, more real. The flashing lights danced across Mercer's face, illuminating the sheen of sweat beading on his brow, his lips curled in a grimace that was somewhere between anger and panic. Danielle's heart pounded, steady and slow, a rhythm she clung to like a lifeline. She couldn't afford to break now, not when she could feel the edge of survival so close. But even as the cavalry approached, a dark part of her questioned, would they come to save her? Or side with him? She knew the weight of that question. Black lives weren't always given the benefit of rescue. Reinforcements often meant escalation, not salvation. The sirens could bring more danger, more men with badges and guns who might see her as the threat. She had trained federal agents in negotiation, overseen task forces dismantling global cybercrime rings, but none of that mattered here. Her skin color spoke louder than her credentials. Mercer's jaw twitched, the gun in his hand wavering for the first time since he'd drawn it. The flicker of blue and red strobed across the two of them, painting the scene like a crime waiting to happen. The distant engine roars turned into screeching tires as black SUVs barreled onto the shoulder behind Mercer's cruiser, skidding to a halt, headlights flooding the scene in white-hot beams. Doors slammed, boots pounded the pavement. Dark figures emerged, cutting imposing shapes against the glow of the emergency lights. Federal agents, Homeland Security insignias glinting in the glare. At the front strode Agent Marcus Sterling, tall, black, his broad shoulders squared beneath the tailored cut of his federal windbreaker. His gaze locked immediately on the raised weapon, on Mercer's gun aimed at Danielle's chest, and his expression darkened with purposeful fury. "Mercer!" Sterling's voice boomed through the night like a gunshot. "Put down your weapon! Now!" Mercer jolted as though struck, his grip tightening reflexively on the gun, the barrel twitching. His mouth opened, but no sound came at first, just a breathless rasp of confusion. "Who the hell are you?" he snapped, trying to gather what remained of his authority, but the crack in his voice betrayed him. "This is my stop. My jurisdiction." Sterling didn't slow. He approached with measured steps, hands visible, no weapon drawn, but his presence was all force. The other agents fanned out, securing the perimeter, their eyes scanning the scene, taking in the horror unfolding beneath the blinking lights. "I'm Special Agent Marcus Sterling of the Department of Homeland Security," Sterling declared, his badge glinting as he raised it high for Mercer to see. "And you're about 2 seconds from facing federal charges for threatening a senior official with a firearm." Mercer's eyes darted between the agents, his grip loosening by a hair. "Senior official?" he echoed, his voice faltering. the bravado draining from his face as though the gravity of his mistake finally began to settle on his shoulders. Danielle's voice sliced through the tension, low but unwavering. "Deputy Director Danielle Vaughn, Homeland Security Cybercrime Division. I told you who I was." Her eyes remained locked on Mercer, holding him in place with the same intensity as the gun he still pointed at her. The words hit Mercer like a slap, his face twisted, denial written across every line. No, you didn't say. You can't be—" But the stammer betrayed him, his mind struggling to rewrite what the facts refused to change. "I said it clearly," Danielle replied, her voice like sharpened steel. "You didn't care to listen." The gun in Mercer's hand began to tremble, the weight of it finally tipping against him. His eyes flicked to Sterling, who had stopped just feet away, his stance radiating command. "Lower the weapon, Officer Mercer. Now, this ends here." For a long breath, Mercer didn't move. His chest heaved, sweat trailing down his temple, the conflict raging behind his eyes. The gun wavered, dipping slightly, before he sucked in a breath and raised it again, defiance flashing across his face. Danielle felt her pulse spike, the gun once more lined with her chest, the danger alive again. But Sterling stepped forward, closing the distance, his voice even but fierce. "I said lower it, or I swear I'll have you cuffed and disarmed before you can blink." Mercer's bravado collapsed. His shoulders sagged. The gun fell to his side, shaking in his grasp, then clattered to the ground as he released it, his hands rising slowly. The air seemed to release, the tension loosening from Danielle's chest just enough for her to breathe again, but the damage had been done. The image of that gun, the threat it held, would never leave her. Sterling turned to Danielle, his expression softening as he nodded to her. "Deputy Director Vaughn, are you all right?" Danielle nodded, though her body trembled beneath the surface. She kept her hands on the wheel, her composure intact even as the aftermath settled over her like a second skin. "I am now." Sterling motioned to two agents, who immediately moved to cuff Mercer, his wrists twisting as they secured the metal around them. The former officer's face burned with humiliation, his eyes darting to Danielle with a mix of disbelief and resentment. "You made a mistake tonight," Sterling said coldly to Mercer. "You didn't just pull a gun on a citizen, you pulled it on the wrong one." As Mercer was led away, Danielle slowly, deliberately released her grip on the steering wheel, her hands stiff from holding herself so still for so long. Her chest rose and fell with deeper breaths, the adrenaline finally beginning to ebb, leaving in its place a raw ache. The power had flipped, but the scars remained. She stepped out of the vehicle, her heels crunching against the gravel shoulder, standing tall beneath the harsh lights of the patrol cars. Her gaze swept the scene, Mercer being stuffed into the back of his own cruiser, the agents securing the area, the red and blue strobes painting the landscape in haunting color. But the war inside her still raged. She had survived this, but survival wasn't enough. The system that allowed a man like Mercer to draw a gun on a black woman without cause, to threaten her life because he felt entitled to, was still alive and well. And Danielle Vaughn knew this was only the beginning. The sun hadn't yet risen, but the world was already on fire. The video footage from Danielle Vaughn's dashboard camera had spread like a brush fire through the early hours, the blinking red recording light, the gun barrel glinting in the dark, and Officer Kyle Mercer's voice snarling threats into the night. Every frame told the story plainly. A black woman in a luxury SUV, calm and compliant, faced down a white officer's rage and his gun. And not just any woman, a deputy director of Homeland Security. But in the glow of the early dawn, her title didn't shield her from what the world had witnessed. Danielle stood at the window of her Arlington home, the early morning light creeping through the blinds. She had barely slept, her body still bracing from the adrenaline that had refused to let her settle. Her hands, steady the night before, now trembled softly as she pressed her fingertips against the cool glass. Outside, life stirred quietly. Neighbors walked dogs, delivery trucks rolled by, the suburban calm betraying none of the outrage coursing beneath the surface. Her phone buzzed nonstop, vibrating across the marble countertop. News outlets, colleagues, lawmakers, activists. Everyone wanted a statement, a reaction, a piece of the storm, now swirling around Officer Mercer's actions. But Danielle hadn't touched the phone. Not yet. Her mind wasn't ready. Instead, she stood there, locked in the memory of that night. The cold metal of the gun pointed at her chest, the weight of helplessness pressing down as if her life had been reduced to the pull of a trigger. She had stared down danger before, in war rooms, in briefing chambers. But this felt different. This wasn't about her rank, her power, her influence. This was about her skin. The federal investigation was already underway, launched the moment Agent Marcus Sterling had called it in. Mercer had been taken into custody, his badge stripped, his service weapon logged into evidence, but Danielle knew this wasn't the end. His actions were only a symptom. The disease ran deeper, woven into the legal system, wrapped in policies that shielded men like him, dressed as standard operating procedure. Her inner turmoil boiled quietly beneath her measured exterior. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Mercer's hand hovering near his holster, saw the rage in his eyes as he refused to see her humanity. No badge, no title, no years of service could save her from that. Her doorbell rang, sharp, jarring. Danielle turned, her spine straightening, as she crossed the room and opened the door to find Sterling standing there. His expression tense, his shoulders heavy with the weight of the fallout. "They're moving fast," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Mercer's booked. The department's spinning, but they know the footage is out. They know they can't bury this." Danielle crossed her arms, her gaze steady but distant. "Can't they?" she murmured. Sterling paused, his jaw tightening. "Not this time. Not with you. Not with the video." But Danielle knew better. She'd seen it too often. Outrage followed by silence, protests followed by policy drafts that gathered dust. Justice wasn't a certainty. It was a fight, one she wasn't sure she had the strength to take on again. "I need you to testify," Sterling said, breaking the silence. "Formal statement. Public hearing. This is bigger than Mercer. We both know that." Danielle turned back to the window, watching the street fill with light. "It always was," she whispered. By noon, the story had cracked wide open. Headlines screamed from every screen. Senior Homeland Security official threatened at gunpoint by local officer. Cable news played the footage on a loop. Mercer's voice sharp, his gun steady, Danielle's calm refusal to move, to shrink, to surrender. Outrage burned across social media. Activists flooded the platforms, demanding Mercer face charges not just for misconduct, but for attempted murder. Hashtags surged. "Survey protect black women." "Chirigi'u justice for Danielle." "Chirigi'u end racial profiling." Strangers recounted their own stories. Traffic stops turned battlegrounds, rights ignored, dignity stripped. Danielle sat quietly in the corner of her office, the weight of every voice, every story pressing down. The helplessness of that night still churned inside her, threatening to collapse the wall she'd built around her composure. But the fire burning beneath that fear wouldn't be silenced. By evening, she faced the cameras, standing before a sea of microphones outside the Alexandria courthouse, dressed in a simple black suit, hair pulled back tightly. Her voice carried not just her story, but the collective cry of thousands. "This isn't just about me," she began, her gaze sweeping the crowd, landing on the faces watching, waiting. "This is about every black woman who has been told she doesn't belong. Every person who has faced a badge wielded as a weapon, not a shield." Her voice never cracked, but behind her words was the trembling heart of a woman who'd felt her life reduced to the whim of a gunman. "Officer Mercer didn't know who I was, and that's the point. He assumed I was no one, that I wouldn't fight back, that my life didn't matter. And if this can happen to me, a federal official, it can happen to anyone." The crowd stood still, silent. This isn't about punishing one officer. It's about exposing a system that allows men like him to believe they are above the law. There must be accountability. There must be change. The press conference shattered headlines, sparked debates in state houses, anger in town halls. Danielle's calm resolve, the footage, the undeniable proof, all of it struck a nerve that couldn't be silenced. But even as the world reacted, Danielle Vaughn knew the deeper battle had only just begun. The trial loomed, the calls for reform roared. Yet behind all the noise, the quiet memory of that night stayed etched in her bones, the weight of Mercer's gun, the systemic rot that gave him permission. And though the system was exposed, Danielle knew her fight wasn't just to hold one man accountable. It was to change the very ground she stood on. The courtroom buzzed, low murmurs filling the vaulted space, tension thick as molasses. Wooden benches groaned beneath the weight of spectators, journalists, activists, and officers both uniformed and plain-clothed, their eyes trained on the defense table where Officer Kyle Mercer sat. His posture stiff, his uniform traded for a bland suit that did little to soften the edges of his arrogance. The walls echoed with history, countless trials, arguments, verdicts. But today, the air itself felt electric, as if justice were no longer routine but a battlefield. At the prosecution table, Danielle Vaughn sat in silent resolve, flanked by federal agents and her legal team, the weight of her badge tucked deep inside her jacket pocket, unseen but never forgotten. But here, that badge wasn't armor. It couldn't shield her from the raw vulnerability of reliving that night. No title, no rank could dull the memory of a gun pointed at her chest, the words of a white officer stripping her of dignity. And now, under the fluorescent hum of courtroom lights, she had to speak those memories aloud, peel back the layers of calm she'd wrapped herself in. The judge, an older black man with eyes carved by years of witnessing injustice, presided over the bench, his gaze sharp beneath silver brows. He banged the gavel once, commanding silence. "All rise," the bailiff called, though the room had already stiffened with anticipation. Mercer sat still, jaw clenched, eyes flicking toward Danielle now and then, as if struggling to reconcile the image of the woman who had sat behind the wheel that night with the powerful figure seated across from him now. The prosecutor rose, her voice firm as she addressed the court. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we will prove that on the night of May 12th, Officer Kyle Mercer abused his power, threatened the life of Deputy Director Danielle Vaughn, and did so not because of lawful cause, but because of racial bias." The jury, a cross-section of the community, shifted in their seats, eyes flicking toward Mercer and then back to Danielle. There was a weight in the room, a silent knowing that this case wasn't just about one officer and one woman. It was about the system that allowed him to act unchecked. The prosecutor cued the dashboard footage. The screen came alive, filling the room with the harsh glare of flashing police lights, the sharp voice of Mercer, the calm, steady replies of Danielle, the metallic scrape of a gun being drawn. Gasps rippled across the gallery as Mercer's voice rang out, "Get out of the car, now, or I swear." The gun barrel, steady in the frame, glinted beneath the moonlight. Danielle's voice followed, quiet but unyielding. "You're breaking the law. Put the gun down." Silence swallowed the room as the video ended, leaving behind a palpable tension, a reflection of the racial injustice too many had lived but never seen so plainly displayed. Mercer's defense attorney rose, adjusting his tie, his voice oily as he addressed the jury. Officer Mercer was responding to a perceived threat. He acted within his training, under stress, in the dark. We asked the jury to consider the difficulty of law enforcement decisions made in split seconds. Danielle's fists tightened beneath the table. Perceived threat. The words curdled in her stomach. She had been calm. She had followed every law, spoken every word carefully. Yet here she was, on trial in spirit, defending her existence while Mercer justified his violence. When the moment came for Danielle to take the stand, the courtroom seemed to shrink around her. Every eye followed her as she stood, walked steadily to the witness box, and took the oath. She straightened her posture, her voice clear as she began, but inside the weight of her trauma pressed hard against her chest. "Please state your name and occupation for the court." "Danielle Vaughn, Deputy Director, Homeland Security, Cybercrime Division." The prosecutor nodded, then leaned in. "Ms. Vaughn, can you walk us through the night of the incident?" Danielle exhaled slowly, the air catching in her throat. She focused on the blinking red light of the recording, the flashlight beam slicing across her face, the gun aimed at her heart. "I was driving home," she began, "following every traffic law. 10 miles from my house I was pulled over without cause. When I asked why, Officer Mercer told me my car looked out of place. I live in that neighborhood." Her voice stayed steady, but every word felt like pulling a thread from the fabric of her composure, exposing the rawness beneath. "I asked for a lawful reason for the stop. I complied. But when I asserted my rights, he escalated. He slammed on my car door, threatened me, and drew his weapon." The jury leaned in, faces etched with a mix of horror and disbelief. "I've trained agents on de-escalation. I've managed crises that affect national security. But that night, none of that mattered. I was a black woman in a car, and he saw me as a threat." Danielle's voice cracked just slightly, the depth of her helplessness seeping through. "Did you ever resist?" the prosecutor asked. "No," Danielle replied firmly. "I never resisted. I only asked for fairness." The defense attorney stood, eager to pounce. "Ms. Vaughn, did you tell Officer Mercer who you were?" "I did," she answered, "but he didn't listen. He didn't care who I was." The lawyer smirked, attempting to rattle her. "Isn't it true that your refusal to exit the vehicle heightened the situation?" Danielle stared him down, her voice unwavering. "Refusing to abandon my rights is not the same as resistance. I wasn't the threat. He was." The courtroom stilled. In closing arguments, the prosecutor stood before the jury, voice rising with righteous fury. "This isn't about split-second decisions. You saw the footage. You heard the words. Officer Mercer escalated a routine stop into a life-threatening confrontation because of his bias. If it hadn't been Ms. Vaughn, a federal official, but someone else, how would that night have ended?" The jury deliberated for hours, tension mounting with every minute. When they returned, the air held its breath. "Guilty," the foreperson announced. "Guilty of abuse of power, endangering a citizen, and acting under racial bias." Danielle didn't move, didn't exhale. She sat rigid, the verdict settling into her bones. Mercer's face drained of color as the judge sentenced him to 5 years in prison, no parole, barred from law enforcement for life. It was justice. But for Danielle, it felt hollow. One man punished, but the system still intact. The battle had been won, but the war for justice wasn't over. The gavel's echo had long faded, but the weight of that courtroom still pressed against Danielle Vaughn's chest. Officer Kyle Mercer was sentenced, the jury's verdict delivered, the cameras had captured their headlines, but Danielle's war wasn't over. How could it be? One man behind bars didn't rewrite the laws that allowed him to pull a gun on her chest without cause, didn't erase the centuries of systemic bias woven into every crack of the legal system. In the quiet of her office, far from the courthouse steps, Danielle stared at the blank page of her next speech, hands trembling faintly. She'd faced rooms of lawmakers, briefed presidents on national threats, but this, speaking for her life, for all those who couldn't, felt heavier than any war room. The memory still burned beneath her skin. Mercer's voice sharp with arrogance, his finger twitching near the trigger, and her own helplessness bottled beneath her steady tone. She had survived, but she hadn't escaped. Outside the glass walls of her building, the world moved on. News cycles shifted, headlines faded, but Danielle's resolve hardened. The footage of that night, the standoff on the roadside, played over and over in her mind. The barrel of Mercer's gun, the words, "Your car looks out of place." How many others had heard those same words before losing their lives? Danielle wouldn't let it be forgotten. She turned that helplessness into purpose, standing before state lawmakers, eyes blazing beneath the surface. Her voice didn't shake as she demanded mandatory body cameras, independent civilian review boards, and penalties for racial profiling that couldn't be softened by officer discretion. But beneath her steady words, the memory of that night gnawed at her. The fear, the rage, the feeling of being reduced to a target, not a person. At community meetings, Danielle listened, truly listened, to mothers whose sons feared routine traffic stops, to teenagers who practiced how to keep their hands on the dashboard, how to stay alive. Their stories cracked something open inside her, the hidden wound that Mercer had left. In a packed church basement, one elderly woman's voice broke as she told Danielle, "I taught my grandson how to survive police before I taught him how to drive." That confession sat heavy in Danielle's heart. She gripped the microphone, swallowing the ache in her throat. "This isn't survival. This is terror, made normal, and I won't let it stand." Months later, the State House floor roared with debate, but Danielle didn't yield. She fought for reform bills, testified about the night she could have been another statistic, another name on a protest sign. And when the governor's pen hit the paper, signing into law new police accountability measures, Danielle stood there, unsmiling, unyielding. She knew the system wouldn't crumble overnight. Mercer was gone, but the roots of racial injustice remained, tangled deep in the soil. Driving home, Danielle passed that same dark stretch of road, headlights cutting through the familiar shadows. This time she didn't tense, she burned. Not with fear, but with the fire of a woman who had stared into the barrel of injustice and vowed to fight until it fell. The seeds of change were planted, and Danielle Vaughn, scarred but unbroken, would make sure they grew. The story of Danielle Vaughn teaches us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the will to stand firm in the face of injustice. Even as a high-ranking federal official, Danielle was reduced in an instant to nothing more than the color of her skin in the eyes of a biased officer. Yet instead of allowing that moment to break her, she transformed her helplessness into purposeful resistance. Her journey reminds us that injustice does not end with one victory. It demands persistence, advocacy, and a voice that never wavers. For those of us in our later years, this story speaks directly to the legacy we leave behind. Every generation faces its battles, but it is our responsibility to ensure the lessons we've learned are passed on, that the seeds of change are watered with our wisdom and resilience. Danielle's courage challenges us to speak up, to listen, and to stand alongside those who fight for fairness, even when the world urges silence. Justice, after all, is not a moment, it's a commitment. And as elders, our voices, stories, and actions remain powerful tools in shaping a world where dignity and respect know no bounds. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like and comment one if you found the story meaningful. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. See you in the next one.